I'm going to come right out and tell you right from the beginning, get my bias right out in the open. I think you should be very careful and very intentional about the choices you make in raising your kids. There you have it. I'm not hiding anything. I think the choice of what activities your children are involved in. I think the choice of how much technology your children have free access to. And I think the choice of where and how you choose to educate your children are the most significant decisions you will ever make in your life. And if you do not have children, the influence that you are able to have on the children in your family or in your neighborhood is really the only lasting influence you will have. And you don't have to go much farther than this year's Grammy Awards, and I hope you didn't watch the whole thing. I hope you were similar to Mandisa, who said, you know what? I just need to not be there. I hope you're similar to Natalie Grant, that at a certain point you said, Jesus is grieving. I need to be leaving. And get yourself up and get out. You don't have to look any farther than the Grammy Awards this year that glorified pornography, mocked the church with a display that looked much like what we have here, and mocked everything we hold dear, and even dabbled in witchcraft right in front of the eyes of millions and millions of viewers. You don't have to go much farther than that to wake up and realize that the trajectory on which our culture is going is drastically different and completely opposed to the course that you and I are on. Now, I'm not coming to bash anything that's going on in the culture, although they're giving me plenty of fodder to do so. How many saw the Bill Nye, the Science Guy debate with Ken Ham? Just raise your hand. I want to know how. Okay, great. I am so glad. That is a great sign to me that there are still people willing to stay tuned to something for 2.5 hours long that doesn't involve a little pigskin going back and forth over 100 yards. The contrast between the worldview of our culture and our worldview as born-again, Bible-believing, Spirit-filled believers could not be any more pronounced. And where that is clear for us is in things like the Grammy Awards or the Bill Nye Science Guy and Ken Ham debate, or even the worship of that silly little leather thing that gets passed back and forth. But where it's built or where it's promoted is in education. And I would say that there was a season in American education where we in Christian education could walk alongside of the government education system. We call them public schools, but essentially they're government-run schools. A lot of implications there, but we walk alongside. And I would say through the 40s and 50s, we could walk together and maybe there wouldn't be so much difference. In the 60s is when we seriously began to lose our moral credibility as a nation, and a lot of that caused a branching apart of a Christian education and a government-sponsored education. And we find ourselves today no longer walking the same path. And if through the 40s, 50s, and 60s we saw a gradual widening of the path, you know what we see today? We see as Christian parents that we're going this way, and as people that are captured and blinded by this world, they're going that way. And it's completely different. And we need to be aware of that as parents, as grandparents, as aunts and uncles, as people that have any influence over children. And I don't think you have to really dig too deep in your own heart if you're a parent, a grandparent, or have any influence over children to say, you know what? What I'm seeing portrayed in front of me as the ultimate good of man on television and in our culture is really not what I want for my kids. I don't think it is. And I think it's time that we as parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, anyone with influence over kids, think very carefully about what we want to see as the end result in our kids' lives. And here's how you can think about it. If you have kids, fast forward 20 years from now, and you're sitting there pining away for the kids to come home, right? Because they've got their own lives and they're out doing things and maybe raising their own kids. As you sit at home waiting for them to come back for Thanksgiving or Christmas, what is it about their lives then that is going to make you most joyful when they come home? What is it that when you're sitting around the table, you're going to sit around and you're going to say, oh, dear God, we are so blessed? And the opposite would be, what is it in your kids' lives 20 years from now that you would say, oh, dear God, help us? This is not what I had intended. And I wish I could sit with everyone who's a parent as you're leaving today. I wish you could forego saying hello to Pastor Zarlingo. You can do that any week. And sit with me. And I just wish I could multiply myself to sit with every parent and hear from you. What is most important for your kids to become? Our world and government-sponsored educational system is going one way. The people of God must, by necessity, go another way because we can't walk together in many ways. And I say that with a great degree of sobriety because I know for a lot of you are thinking, whoa, he's coming on pretty strong. Well, here's what you can do with that. Just think about it and do a little research yourself. Find out what the ultimate good of schooling is for you today, and I'll give you a little hint and get you started on your research. I am so grateful that we have a school board here at Smithtown Christian School that has voted, after much prayer and research and consideration, to, as a school, not adopt the Common Core state standards. I think that's the best decision we've made in a long time as a school. And we could talk about that all morning, but this isn't a rally for education, although we could, but we won't, I promise. But if you just look at the end, let's just look at the end. The reason why our government is all up in arms about education is because we're producing students that are not ready for college, and because we've lost our place in economic leadership in the world. And the solution is what I think many of you would agree after doing not a lot of research. The solution that they've offered is a failing and misguided set of educational standards that's going to treat every student like they're the same, that's going to put an enormous emphasis on standardized testing as if it were possible to put more on it, and is going to strip our children of our intellectual heritage and cultural heritage in America. I think that's a bad idea. But what's an even worse idea is what's driving it. Those that shape the Common Core, and particularly in New York State, those that have adopted in the state education department are saying the ultimate good for our students when they get through 12 years of schooling with us should be that they are college and career ready. Sounds good, right? Well, I have a lot of questions for you, educational people. What does it mean to be college ready? Well, if you look on the New York State education website, and you can find out, you can download it yourself, find out what it means to be college ready. You know what that means? Prepare yourselves. It means that students are only college ready if they get a 75 on their English regents and an 80 on any one of their math regents. Does that strike you as odd? I mean, when I was a kid, a 75 was something you were ashamed of and you didn't bring home to mom and dad. Do you remember trying to get the mail before mom and dad did on report card day? We do it all electronically, so we can't do that anymore. But 75, you know, those were not really the up-and-coming leaders of the class. It was me, unfortunately, at the time, because I was such a goof-off. But 75 does not represent academic excellence, nor does 180 on the 3 math exams you've got to take. So the standards are so low. In fact, what's driving a lot of the Common Core is to get everybody at the same place. Why would we want to do that? But even more frightening than that is the ultimate goal, not just as college readiness, but on the end of a lengthy PowerPoint that's on the New York State Education Department that you can go and get yourself, is kind of the wrap it all up of the Common Core. And it shows a graph. On the one side is a bar graph showing the income of students who don't go to college. On the other, it shows a graph of students who do go to college. And it's kind of the altar call for the Common Core. Like the final thing. In summary, now here's what's most important, is that your kids must make more money than you. And the United States must regain its economic leadership in the world. And I think that's really opposed to what we as Christian parents say. I think our children need to make exactly the amount of money they need in order to fulfill God's purposes for their lives. And if we're even going to look at the country, I say America needs to restore its moral leadership in the world. And the Common Core, see, they're really not a political rally, really. I'm not running for office, I promise you. The Common Core is a failed method of teaching children to reach ends that you and I don't agree with anyway. And it produces what we see in the Grammys, or in other venues where we see our worldview is just radically different from the world. It is going to get much harder to raise kids than it is today. Your children may not enjoy the freedom and the comfort that you have. And if not your children, yours and my grandchildren are in for a big difference. And it's not just in income levels between me and my grandchildren. There's coming a day when our children and grandchildren will not be able to proclaim that they are Christians. And if they do, it will be a watered-down, tolerant version of Christianity, which is losing influence day by day in the true church, but actually gaining influence in our world. It's a Christianity that says everybody's right, and I'm not going to offend you. It's a Christianity that says, and I've heard this written about the debate this week on the blogosphere, what's the big thing about theology? That's not the point anymore in the church. We just have to love each other. And you've probably seen it too, right? That's the brand of Christianity that will only be accepted. So if your kids are on fire for Jesus Christ, have convictions, have a biblical worldview, can speak with authority to the cultural issues of our day, they will be persecuted. My own children, it's breaking my heart. I look around my home and the comforts that I enjoy, and I think, you know what? It could be a generation where my kids will not be able to have this if they're true, genuine believers. And if you don't think that can happen, open your history book. Just look through the ages of how the church has been persecuted. And for us to think we're going to be able to sit on padded pews and enjoy the lifestyle we've enjoyed forever, and our kids are going to as well, we're sadly mistaken. Well, that's really a plug for Smithtown Christian School in not so much disguise. Today we have an open house where if anything that I say this morning, or anything that I don't say and the Holy Spirit says to you, pricks your heart and say, okay, I haven't even thought about this education thing. I just pay too much taxes here. I haven't even thought of a Christian school education because I pay for an education, right? If anything has pricked your heart, we have an open house for you in room A111. Go towards the restrooms, make a right down the hallway. I'll be there, other folks, just to talk to you about the school. We will not strong-arm you or guilt you or shame you into looking at Smithtown Christian School, but at least take a look. At least say, I wonder what God might have for me and my kids. Well, in the big picture, there are 10, and I'm not going to talk about all 10, I'm only talking about one, 10 what we call as a school golden outcomes that if you walk by our brand spanking new school office and look in, you'll see with a nice spotlight on it. 10 words, and I'm going to get to them really quickly here. I'm going through a bunch of things that I've already said. Come on, we're almost there. 10 words: character, relationships, convictions, worldview, intellect, communication, wisdom, talents, servanthood, and influence. See those words down the right side and the one on the left? Those are why we as a school exist, and everything we do is wrapped around producing those in our children from preschool and daycare all the way through to 12th grade. So if those are some of the ultimate outcomes you have, which I think you do for your kids, I would ask you to consider Smithtown Christian School. But I want to talk in general about one of these, one that pulsates in my heart this morning, and that is the idea of wisdom. It's underlined there for you, wisdom. Wisdom is no longer prized in our culture, is it? I think stupidity has taken the place that wisdom once had. I see it as I'm standing on the line next to people at 7-Eleven. I see it in the popular media. I see it in songs and movies that glorify being dumb, that make the hero not being the smart one, but the buffoon. We become a culture that prizes stupidity. How different is that? Stupidity, wisdom of the Lord. When I say wisdom and ask you, who do you think of first? I would bet most of you just with some level of biblical literacy said, Solomon, wisdom. And I want to examine the life of Solomon this morning quickly with you and derive some principles for us as parents, because there's a big question that I have for you. We want this in our kids. Of all the other things, when they drive into my driveway 20 years from now, I don't really care what car they're driving. I care if they're walking in the door being wise young men and women. I don't really care how much they're making for money, although I'd really like them to provide for me in my old age because I'm not so sure I'm going to be able to do it myself. But ultimately, I want them to be wise. I'd rather they bring to me when I'm old and crusty their wisdom rather than their financial support. Wisdom is supreme. Wisdom, get wisdom, my kids. Oh, how I want my kids to have wisdom. And I want every one of the 600 kids here at Smithtown Christian School from daycare through to senior year to walk out of the doors here having biblical wisdom akin to what Solomon had. But how does that happen? How does someone become so wise? I think there's two options. Option number one is kind of the Aristotle model of wisdom. And that's where a person can spend their entire lives studying the world around them, trying to understand, making categories, classifications, making connections between realities that they see. And wisdom can be the product of years and years of that kind of observation and reflection. Was that how Solomon became the wisest man that ever lived? What's option number two? Option number two would be what I think most of you think is the case with Solomon, if I could jump inside your brain and see what you're thinking. Because immediately your mind goes to Solomon's coronated as king. That night he goes to sleep after the inauguration banquets and all that. And God wakes him up in a dream and says, ask whatever you wish. And what does Solomon ask for? He asks for wisdom. And I think conventional understanding of that in the church is that at that moment, God came in like the New Testament gift of wisdom, which he does, and just zapped him with wisdom. And all of a sudden, Solomon woke up and he realized, wow, I'm really wise. Is that how Solomon became the wisest man that ever lived? Well, there's an interesting backstory to the life of Solomon and that critical moment in Solomon's life when he asked for wisdom. And you know who had a significant impact on him becoming a man of wisdom? His dad, his father, King David. Turn with me to Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 3 through 9. Proverbs 4, 3 through 9. This is kind of the introductory couple chapters of the book of Proverbs, where we just read line after line of incredible wisdom and insight into the way the world works. And listen to what Solomon says as he sets it up. In chapter 4, verse 3, it says, and Solomon is talking to his sons right now, and he says this, when I was a boy, verse 3 of chapter 4 of Proverbs, when I was a boy in my father's house, still tender and an only child of my mother, he taught me. And he goes on to say something very amazing that was what I believe is one of those, those audio tapes you got in your brain from your childhood that your parents always said? Some of them really good, some of them not so good, of what your parents said. Well, listen in on the audio tape from Daddy David to little Solomon. When he was tender, it says, my dad told me these things since I was tender, since I was young, vulnerable, malleable. My father has been saying this, lay hold of my words with all your heart. Keep my commands and you'll live. Verse 5, get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forget my words or swerve for them. Do not forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. Love her, and she'll watch over you. Wisdom is supreme. Therefore, get wisdom. Though it cost you all you have, get understanding. Esteem her, and she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. She will set a garland of grace on your head and present you with a crown of splendor. So as a young boy, Solomon was actively, intentionally shaped by his dad's words. When I first saw this, I was amazed because I, maybe like many of you, thought it was like a spur-of-the-moment blast of wisdom on Solomon. But that was only the fulfillment of years of a faithful dad, a faithful teacher, shaping the heart of his young charge to where later it was the natural request that Solomon had. But there's more than that. If you can just picture young Solomon causing some havoc in the palace, running around doing his things, and King David grabbing him by the ear and pulling him aside and reminding him about wisdom. As he became older and was starting to take on maybe more responsibility in the family business, I can imagine David sitting with Solomon as they're talking about how to reign and how to be a good king and talking about wisdom. I believe what we read here is a recording that Solomon heard many times over in his childhood, over and over again. Dads, moms, teachers, aunts, uncles, grandparents, you can have an amazing influence on the little people in your life simply by telling them the truth. And yes, sometimes they'll roll their eyes, "Dad, again?" But there's a lot of times when in their lives, or every time you say it, every time you repeat it, every time you bring it to them, it's building in them a desire for what you're talking about. So the opposite is if you don't say anything, then they're left to have their desires shaped by whoever is playing the recording. Think about that. What are the recordings we have today that are being played in front of our kids ad nauseum? If ever there was a time where parents' recording needs to be louder, more consistent, more firm, more directive, more protective, it is now. And you've got to make sure your kids are in places where the recordings fit the ones they're getting at home. So there's not this dissonance in our young, tender kids' lives of which recording is going to shape who I am. There's a tremendous battle for the recording in your children's mind. Turn to 1 Kings chapter 2, because we get an additional detail here of how David had this tremendous impact. The first one was that he told him about wisdom from when he was very young and shaped his desires. But in 1 Kings chapter 2, it's coming to the end of David's reign as the king, and he's getting ready to hand over the kingdom to his son. And so, like a good leader, he's giving instructions to the up-and-coming leader on how to do a good job. He's going through every detail, the detail of how to build the temple, which is the unfinished product that David had bid on and lost, right? God gave it to his son to do. But David prepared him. David did a good job of preparing him to receive the baton of leadership of the nation of Israel. But as he's doing so, he's giving him all these very specific directions. And in verse 8, he's telling him about this one guy who really gave him a lot of trouble. And I can just imagine, my dad's a contractor, and for many years I worked with him. Had I kept going in that train of life, I would have eventually taken over the family business. And my dad would have sat with me and said, "Okay, Raj, these are the plumbers to use. These are the electricians to use, but you want to stay away from him. These are the customers that have been good. These are the ones you got to be," right? I mean, it's natural what a good business owner or legacy builder would do with the up-and-coming leader. That's exactly what David is doing. So he says in verse 8, "Remember, you have with you Shammai, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bechorim, who called down bitter curses on me the day I went to Manaim. When he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, I will not put you to death by the sword. But now he's given instructions to Solomon, do not consider him innocent." Now forget what he just said, because it's not real pleasant, right? He was telling him about one of the bad guys, so to speak. But here's what happens next. As he's giving him very specific instructions, it's like David has an aha moment. And look what he says. "You are a man of wisdom. You'll know what to do." Wow. I can picture Solomon kind of taking notes, fast and furious to make sure he's getting down everything Dad says. And then right in the middle of all these specific instructions, Dad says, wait a minute. Solomon, I don't need to be telling you all this in such detail, perhaps. You are a man of wisdom, and you'll know what to do. Now, interestingly, this was before God appeared to him in a dream and said, you can have anything you want. He'd asked for wisdom. So I don't even know if he was very wise yet. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was showing signs of budding wisdom. We're not sure. But dads can see beyond what's today and have a powerful influence on your children's tomorrow by speaking into their lives who you see them becoming. I'll never forget the day. I don't remember where we were, but I remember the day and I remember the feeling when working alongside of my dad with my tool belt strapped on. We're looking at this difficult project. I was probably, 20, 21 years old, 22 years old. We're working on a project, and it was really befuddling us how to handle it on the construction site. And I was accustomed to my dad saying, no, what you do here is da-da-da-da-da-da, whatever, and give me very specific instructions, and then I would do them. This day was different. He turned to me and he said, this was amazing. Roger, how do you think we should handle this? What was that symbolic of? Could I handle it? I don't know. Maybe I had the wherewithal to do it by myself. But something happened in me when my dad called forth my inner carpenter, shall we say, if you can work with me on the analogy. He had trained me, he'd worked with me, and there comes a time where you go past the training and the working with, and you start the calling out of what has been put there. And so long before we ever know whether he was the wisest man in the world, David spoke that into existence in a way, figuratively. He spoke it over his sons' lives. Why is it so easy to tell our kids what they're doing wrong and so hard to speak the good things over them? I mean, even when you're teaching them to drive, right? Did you see that pedestrian? Don't hit that kid. That turn was kind of close. Slow down. Brake sooner. Brake less. Don't brake so hard, right? Why is it so hard to say, hey, that was a nice turn you just made there? Hey, you're really obeying the speed limit. I commend you. I don't know, I find it with myself, I'm quicker to point out what they're doing wrong than to affirm and call out the right. So long before Solomon ever asked God for wisdom, he had a dad who was speaking it into his life and affirming the good that he saw, giving him responsibility, turning over the reins of the kingdom before they were actually being turned over. And what a great example for us as parents, teachers, people in places of influence over kids' lives to start calling that out and saying what we see in the future. So David taught his son very clearly. He spoke it over his son. Now turn with me to 1 Chronicles chapter 22 and verses 11 and 12. Now it comes to the actual literal baton pass of the government. It's passing from King David to King Solomon. This is it. This is the final moment. And here's what David says to his son. He says in verse 11 of 1 Chronicles chapter 22, "Now, my son, the Lord be with you, and may you have success and build the house of the Lord your God as he said you would." Now listen to this. "May the Lord give you discretion and understanding when he puts you in command over Israel, so that you may keep the law of the Lord your God." David basically pronounces a public blessing, but you know what a public blessing is? It's a private prayer that everyone else can eavesdrop on. That's essentially what it is. Really what Dave's doing, we're close. What David is doing here is praying publicly what I have a hunch he was praying all of Solomon's life. He was instructing Solomon. He was speaking words over his life, and he was a praying dad, teacher, aunt, uncle, grandparent over the life of this young man. So it is no wonder to me that when we fast forward to 2 Chronicles, a few days or hours later, 2 Chronicles chapter 1, the Lord appears to Solomon in a dream in verse 7 of chapter 1 of 2 Chronicles. And it says, "That night God appeared to Solomon and said to him, 'Ask for whatever you want me to give you.' Solomon answered God, 'You have shown great kindness to David my father,' verse 8, 'and made me king in his place. Now, Lord God, let your promise to my father David be confirmed, for you have made me king over a people who are as numerous as the dust of the earth.' And here's the request. Give me wisdom and knowledge that I may lead these people." And God grants it to him. But the backstory is that there was a dad / teacher / boss, grandparent, keep extending it, aunt, uncle behind the scenes. To when Solomon got to that one moment where God basically gives him a blank check, that the desire of his heart had been so shaped by the environment he was in that he couldn't help but ask for what was right and true and good. And so my charge to you as parents, aunts, uncles, et cetera, all down the line, harness every opportunity, even when they're tender, to teach them the ways of the Lord. Speak life over them. Speak what you want them to become. If you see a seed of generosity in your child's life, don't criticize how poorly they do things without also saying, you know what? I believe God's going to use you to be incredibly generous for his kingdom. If you see a child that has a mercy gifting, that initial mercy gifting that has a heart for people, instead of saying, would you stop crying and kind of clean up? What if you said, you know what? God's going to use you to have a merciful approach towards others in your life. Speak it into their lives. Thirdly, pray, intercede, bless publicly our children and our grandchildren. So that when that moment comes, and I don't know what it'll be for your kids or my grandchildren, but when it comes to that moment of blank check from God and he says, whatever you want, their natural response will be that which their loving, godly parents spoke into their lives. That loving, godly parents had them in environments which would be consistent with that audio tape of their lives so that they would become truly what God wants them to be. Pastor?